All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening to everyone that's connecting in from Scarsdale and Edgemont. My name is Emily Tao, and I'm a junior at Edgemont High School, and I'm going to be your host for the evening. So on behalf of Edgemont's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and the ACE Club at Scarsdale High School, we welcome you all to this talk and Q&A session, which is in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. So really, really excited to have you all here today. And so to help me out, I'm joined by three of my friends, and together we're going to be moderating the event. So yeah, do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hi everyone, I am Karen Lee. I am a senior and the co-founder of the Asian Conscientization and Empowerment Club at Scarsdale High School.
Hi, my name is Nishna Nandakumar, and I am part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at Edgemont High School, and I'm a junior.
Hi everyone, I'm Serena Wang, and I'm also a junior at Edgemont High School, and I'm in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee.
Yeah, so we're so happy to introduce our guest speaker for the night, Ruth Chan. Ruth is a Brooklyn-based writer and illustrator. Yeah, and her work includes The Great Indoors and Where's the Party? And she was raised in Canada, Hong Kong, and China, and she's a background as an educator, having graduated from Wellesley College and the Harvard Grad School of Education. So Ruth, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me. So excited to be here tonight. I thought before we get into some Q&A, I thought I would show you guys a little bit about what I do and talk a little bit about myself. So hang tight because I'm just going to talk about me for the next couple minutes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. I am a visual learner, and so I feel like showing you guys some of my journey and my path is the best way to do it is through a presentation. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here. And like Emily mentioned, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm originally from Canada. So I was born and lived in Ottawa until I was 13. And then I moved to Hong Kong and then to Beijing. So I finished high school in Beijing, and then I came to the US to go to college and grad school, and I've been here ever since. So moved around a lot, but it's been really great. Hello. So Emily mentioned that I'm an illustrator, and most of my work is children's picture books. So I am an author and an illustrator. Some of the books, as you can see here, I write and illustrate. And some others, I illustrate other people's texts. And it's kind of split 50-50, but there's sort of all types of different books. Here are some examples of the interiors of the books. Here is my former cat. And this is a Seek and Find book that hasn't come out yet. It's coming out in September. And this was the first, I usually work traditionally, but this is the first book I did all on the iPad, which is pretty phenomenal what technology can do right now. This is another book that just came out in April called The Alpactory, which is all about a factory full of alpacas that will pack for you. But really, it's about new experiences and what we can do to prepare for new experiences. And here's another spread from that book, The Alpactory. And this is another book that has yet to come out, coming in September. My first people book. And this book is called Thank You, Neighbor. And I made it out of the pandemic during a time where you couldn't really go anywhere. That was when we were all staying inside, and the most we would see are our neighbors, right? And I realized that our neighbors are the ones that kind of help our neighborhood feel like home. And even if they're just very simple things like saying hello and thank you, it was sort of like what made me feel safer and what made me feel less lonely during that pandemic time. So I decided to make a book about that. I also make comics. So some of them are things that I've seen or heard. So here I was on a plane and there was a mom who said, "What's the capital of Belgium?" And the kid looks up from his zombie games and he's like, "Waffles." Sometimes they're really quick things like that. Sometimes I do comics for children's magazines. So this one was just about the fall. They were like, "Do a comic about the fall." And so I'll let you guys read that on your own. But most of the stuff that I do, you'll notice there's a lot of humor in it. And I think that, and we'll get into that later, but I do feel like humor is something that really elevates things, whether it's something serious, whether it's something hard, whether it's something fun or lovely or beautiful. Just humor sort of like brings out another dimension to things. I'm also working on a graphic novel right now about, it's a middle grade graphic memoir about my move from Canada to Hong Kong and kind of the weirdly reverse culture shock that I experienced as a person growing up in Canada and then moving to Hong Kong and realizing like, oh, I'm not as Chinese as I thought I was because my Cantonese is terrible and there's all these customs that I wasn't used to. So here are a couple example spreads. And I also talk about my father's story of how he was born during the Sino-Japanese War and my family basically had to be on the run escaping the Japanese invasion. And that was when my father was born. So I kind of weave that into the story as well. And here's another example from that graphic novel of my first day at school, which was terrifying. So, picture books, graphic novels. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how did I get here? How did I become an illustrator and an author? So here's me. I can't hear you guys, but I know you're all going, "Aw." So this is me. I was 2. I clearly have the same hair almost. Not much has changed. But I really loved books. And more than reading, I really loved the pictures, right? Even before I could read or really even articulate things, I loved pictures. And I really love drawing. This is one of my first drawings. It's not very good. It's like a happy face. But I kind of kept drawing. Again, like not amazing. It's not like my parents saw this and were like, "She's an artistic prodigy." Like it was not. I mean, he's saying I'm big biceps. There are no biceps, right? And this was Spider-Man. This is not Spider-Man. We all know what Spider-Man looks like, but it was so fun to me, right? To sort of draw. And I also made books. And this is the first book that I made called On Your Marks, Get Set, Bo, 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 Go. Book number 1, written and illustrated by Ruth Chan. And here's the thing that I noticed about this book when I found it was I was sort of obsessed with this idea of my name being in this book. Like I remember that moment where it kind of blew my mind where I was like, I have this thing, I made it and my name is on it and other people are going to see it and see my name and know that I made it. So you'll see here, it says written and illustrated by Ruth Chan, a Ruth Chan production. We're not even done yet because I have another title page and it says all rights reserved, Ruth Chan Inc., published by the Ruth Chan Press. So, even early on, there was something like really fascinating to me about like making an object that you write and that you illustrate and that's something that is like wholly mine, but also something that's shareable. I even made a sequel called A Wicked Farmer. And, there's like words coming out like slaughter that horse. And I think I made this when I was like 9. I wonder if my teachers were kind of freaking out that this 9-year-old was writing like slaughter that horse all over the place. But, I kept sort of drawing. And so, when I was in middle school, it was this thing where I loved certain things and I'm going to learn how to copy it basically. So I copied Garfield. And then I started painting and that was like my realism stage where I was like, oh, everything I make to be good art has to be like realistic. I made this when I was, I think 15, from this place in, I think Malaysia. So I made this painting. I was like, yeah, it's super real. It's good art. And I, in my sketchbook, I was trying to sketch things realistically. In college, even, I was making stuff that was like as realistic as possible because it felt like fine art to me. But, it's like, it's not bad, right? It's pretty good, I guess, but it wasn't really expressing me as a person until another class in college I did in 2D design. And I drew these guys about wearing masks. And I thought, okay, well, this actually feels more like me. Like for some reason, this is not so much me, but this really is. And you can kind of see like there's already a style that you saw in my books already. But then, I finished grad school and I started teaching. And I taught pre-K, elementary, and then I worked with community-based nonprofits with underserved communities to do after-school and summer programming. And then things kind of took a sideways turn as life does. And I'll talk about this later, but basically a whole bunch of things happened in my life and I had to really reassess, like, what do I really want to do, right? I like teaching, but what do I really want to spend my time doing? I thought, like, I'm going to like art, I've always loved art and I really want to figure out like if I can make this a career, which is tough, right? Because as a child of immigrant parents who came to North America to like make a living and make their life better, the biggest nightmare for them is a child that's like, I'm going to be an artist and have no guarantee of income. But, it was something that I felt like I needed to do. So I started drawing these little portraits to sort of like express how I was feeling about figuring out all of this career stuff, right? It's hard when you have this idea of what you're going to be or where you want to go, and then something sort of switches it up and like all of a sudden your path is kind of like going sideways. It's scary. So this one says, sometimes you just have to step out of your comfort zone to see the world differently. And this one is, sometimes you just have to make the best of what you have. They're using their leashes as jump ropes. And this one was the one that really like hit me hard. And it says, it's a hedgehog and she has pillows on her back. It says, she braced herself and decided right then and there she'd do what she'd always had a heart for, even if she was plagued with a fear of inevitable failure. And that was very much me, where it was like, I want to try this art career. I might fail at it, but that's not a reason for me not to try. So I was kind of drawing these and I was sort of like trying to figure out what I was doing. And because I was a teacher, I thought, well, making picture books, I've read so many picture books. They're so beautiful. They're like funny. They have good art. There's beautiful writing. It like encompasses everything that I really love about art, right? Or literature. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to make a book. So I, was kind of sketching out different things. And eventually did make a book. This is my first book, Where's the Party? And there's Georgie. This was the first version. Not as great. Second version, much cuter. But, that was just the beginning of my career. And to be really established in it, I realized there's a couple of things. And so there's 4 things that we're going to talk about now really quick. One, I realized it takes a lot of work, like a lot of work. So here are a bunch of picture books in my dog who got in the photo. But it took a lot of research. I read a ton of picture books. I copied their art. I copied the words just to like feel the rhythm and stuff. And then I started drawing. Like, these things don't even make any sense. It was just like doodles in a sketchbook, not trying to put too much pressure on myself, just having fun, right? These are germs. I'm pretty sure that's not any actual bacteria or virus, but they're cute. And I, just drew things that kind of made me laugh and were sort of like exciting to me. So this was my Beagle math series. And, again, I drew things that sort of were delightful to me. And the idea of like animals and sweaters. Have you guys ever seen a snake in a sweater? It's like the cutest thing, even if you don't like snakes. So, I drew things that I really wanted to draw to build up my portfolio. There's that first version of Georgie until I was able to make books. So it's a lot of work, a lot of work. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of how I made the cover of this book, because it takes about 2 to 3 years to make a book. It's a lot of work. So, in making the cover, I chose a couple thumbnails of like possibilities of how I'd want the cover to look. I settled on this one. I sketch out the whole cover in pencil. I use like a light table to sort of trace it out onto the good paper very lightly. And then what I do is I use ink and a paintbrush to go over and do all the line work with a paintbrush. And I like using a paintbrush because it's got a little bit more of like a energy to the line versus just using a pen, but that's just what I like to do. There's my Georgie. And then I use watercolor paint and basically color it in. And that's kind of how I made the whole book. So here is my messy desk with all of the paintings and my watercolor paints and stuff. And then we have the cover. So, again, it's a lot of work. So the next thing that I realized, and I think is really important, and I wish somebody had told me this before, is like, your journey doesn't have to be linear, right? Like we have, especially in high school, it's like we have our SATs, we have our college apps, we have all this stuff to sort of like get to these places that we want to be at. And that's not a bad thing to get there, but life throws you curveballs all the time, and that's okay, right? I'm so much happier right now as an illustrator. Don't get me wrong, I love teaching, but this is like, it feels like my calling, but it took a while to get there, very unexpectedly. So this is the studio I work in Brooklyn. My studio mate makes giant piñatas. It's very fun. For example, as a metaphor for things not being linear, this is a page in the book that's sort of like a Rube Goldberg chain reaction thing. And I'll show you guys a little bit about my process of like how I tried to figure it out. So, I wanted all these things to happen in one page, but this had no like time frame, and it was just like very messy. And I had to remember, like, 4-year-olds are reading this book. It has to make sense. It has to be clear. So I tried making it alphabetically, alphabetized, whatever, you guys know. And doing ABC, but still it's like a little messy, and they're kind of like too small to really see clearly. So then I tried breaking it up and putting arrows, but that's still pretty confusing for like a 4-year-old. So I made a box and numbers so that your eye kind of follows that from one to the next, to the next, to the next, until finally that's kind of how we had it. So again, it's like a lot of life, a lot of career, a lot of like your art or your work. It's like a lot of problem solving and a lot of unexpected twists and turns. The other thing I've learned is art can be just for you. Like, you don't have to make it a career. You don't have to show it. You don't have to put it on Instagram, right? And this is something that I made just for me. So last year, my dog, who was 16, died. He was very old, and it was really sad. Like, he'd been with me the whole time, his whole life, and it was hard to process. So I started making these little paintings based off of real pictures. So there's the Georgie the cat that's in my books, and Feta the dog. And making these little tiny paintings, they're not a big deal. Sort of like help me kind of process my grief, right? And it wasn't really for anybody else, but it really helped me. And I did it during, I don't know if you guys know Inktober, but October, every day in October, you do a drawing. So this is what I did. I did 30 drawings of Feta. Sometimes I just doodle and make weird characters. Sometimes I draw butts, because what's not to love about a butt? This was something I did while I was working on the alpaca book. And this one I call blob cats, where I just make blobs with paint and then I make them into cats. And these are just, again, they're for me, or they're for, something else that's not necessarily has this big goal. And there's something like very like therapeutic about, right? This was during the election when I was very nervous and I made this comic. A lot of people were like, this is not kid appropriate. And it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be kid appropriate. And this is sort of like a comic I made about the artist's journey of always sort of like questioning yourself and I feel that every day where I'm like, am I good enough at this? Like, do I know what I'm doing? I don't. Like, can I do this as a career? I don't know. But this one, this is the most important to me right now, is that art can also connect even when you least expect it. So, when all of the Asian hate crimes started, I started really thinking about like, who am I as an Asian, especially living in America right now? What does that mean? And what are my feelings and thoughts? And I found that the only way I could really process it was through making comics. So I'm going to read 3 of them for you guys. And I have a bunch now. I think there's like 10, and they're all on my Instagram, which you guys can look at later. But so this is the first one, and I'll read it out loud. When I was 11 or so, my mom and I were driving on a snowy day in Toronto, when some car cut in front of us, and the guy blasted his horn, honk, and my mom's going, "Ay-ya." He rolled down his window and yelled, "Go back to your country, bitch." In that split second, I didn't know what he meant, and matching his aggression, yelled back, "I'm from this country," which I'm pretty proud of even to this day. My mom told me to stay quiet, scared to incite more anger. The guy drove off, and in his wake, I tried to figure out why I was so angry. I remember the moment I realized what he meant. He meant, you're not like me. You don't belong here, and you offend me. And refused to see us as a mother driving her daughter to school on an icy, snowy day. The injustice of that assumption made me angry in a way I'd never felt. It made me feel unseen and like I was doing harm just by being. Yet at the same time, I remember thinking, if he hears that I don't have an accent, that I'm not one of them, he'll realize his mistake and live with that guilt forever. And there's me speaking perfect English. It makes me sad to think of 11-year-old me carrying something like that without even realizing there was a problem with it, to justify away otherness, to absorb the anger, to dislike her own kind, and to be okay with being unseen. To see this kind of hate-filled sentiment being spread now, 30 years later, enrages me. But instead, this time I'd say, don't you dare project your own insecurities and unprocessed emotions onto me. I am my own person, and I have a name, and I belong here as much as you do. So this was, like I mentioned, this was sort of one of the first comics that I made about, being Asian and sort of the experiences I had with discrimination. And the amazing thing is that so many people responded to this comic saying, oh, I've had a similar experience. And it blew my mind how many Asian Americans have had this kind of like awful behavior happen to them. But in some ways it was also beautiful because it was connecting all of us, right? And everyone started telling their own story. Then the Atlanta shooting happened. And so I made this comic. When I called my mom today, the first thing she said to me was, be careful out there. Don't go outside. Be careful. It's getting worse. Normally, I'd have rolled my eyes because I've heard it my entire life, right? I'm holding some bow and she's like, be careful. I'm like getting out of the car. She's like, be careful. I'm on the subway in New York and I hear her saying, be careful. I'm walking the dog at night on the phone and she's saying, be careful. But today's incident hit in a different way. If a victim of anti-Asian crime could be a gas station owner, the elderly walking on the street, women working survival jobs in a massage parlor, it could be any other Asian person. I don't want this to be about me, yet I can't help but think it could even be me. I don't feel safe. The attackers and the murderer didn't know the people they harmed. In fact, they couldn't have cared less who they were as people, save for the fact that they were Asian. I think of my parents, both in their 70s, thinking, why not me? It could be me next. And that breaks my heart and fills me with rage. And then people in the media say, this is not about you, it's about someone having a bad day. What a way to make us feel even more unseen, more unsafe, more alone. Some friends and family have checked in on me, Asians and non-Asians alike, and to hear someone saying even just, I see you and hear your pain and anger, or I see this and acknowledge it's not okay, it really means a lot. And that really did mean a lot, you know, during that time when we're all sort of like trying to figure out how we feel about this awful thing that happened, just to have people reaching out and saying like, are you okay? You know, that made me feel seen, like it was important. I was important. And so, you know, from that came this opportunity to do a comic for the New York Times that was not so much about anti-Asian hate, but more about Asian identity and thinking about, you know, immigrant parents and sort of like what it means to be Asian American here. So this is the last one I'll read. When I was in preschool, my mom would drop me off every morning and would be there waiting at the end of the day to pick me up. One day, as school let out, she greeted me and took my hand as she normally did. As we walked to the car, I asked her, how come all the other parents bend down and hug their kids, but you don't hug me? To me, it looked like all the other parents were so happy to see their kids, like they missed not seeing them all day. Had my mom missed me all day? Was she happy to see me? My mom explained to me that hugging was a new thing to her. She says, hugging didn't exist in Chinese culture when I was growing up. And she also said, my parents never hugged me, so I'm not used to something like that. But the next day when she picked me up from school, she bent down and gave me a hug. There must have been a deep sadness for my mom in realizing that I was hurting because of a cultural difference. When she gave me that hug, she was acknowledging that the both of us would always be straddling two different cultures. My mom still hugs me now. And when she does, I'm reminded of that first hug and how much she's done for me so that as both Chinese and Canadian, I might feel like I belong. So, and this is my Instagram if you guys want to look at any other comics that are in there. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. Thank you guys for listening. And I guess we'll get to, you guys get to ask me questions now.
Yeah, so I like really loved especially the last comics because I like related to so many of those things when I was looking through it. Like you mentioned earlier, you were talking about that sort of like reverse sort of like cultural shock when you moved like to Hong Kong and to Beijing. And like there's something like, we were looking at one of the like pictures that was on your portfolio, like I think Miss Joseph, if you don't mind sharing. And it was about like food. It had like 4 bowls and it had like all these like things that were like marinating. And yeah, and it just like got me thinking, like, could you talk about what food means to you? And like also just like the cultural significance of food? Because like food is such like a big part of the way to like Asian people all around the world like sort of connect, like through that shared experience. You're talking about like bao. I noticed in some of your work you mentioned like danjian, which are like egg rolls. So yeah, like tell us more about that. Like how do you feel about food?
I mean, I love food. How can you not love food? And I do feel like there's something like very special about food where it's like engaging all of your senses, right? It's kind of like that moment in Ratatouille, you know, where he like sips the ratatouille and he gets like transported back to when he was a child and his parents like lifting his chin. And I feel like that's the same way with all of us, where when you eat something, it like transports you back to this place. And I think, you know, for me and for my parents, like having that food, having Chinese food is this connection back to, like, for my parents, where they came from and their childhood and their family and everything that they've known and their culture, in such like a real way. And I think that's so powerful. And I think it's like, you know, for example, in Chinese food, there's so much history involved in Chinese food. And it's, you know, it's like geographically, it's very different based on when like time-wise food has changed. And so there's just like so much rich history and culture that comes with like a single dish of food, right? And for me now, especially here living in New York, and I don't live with my parents, anytime I have Chinese food and even like ordering in Chinese, it like sort of like reminds me of like who I really am, like who, I mean, not who I really am, but who I also am, right? Like I'm Chinese. Yeah, this was an illustration I did for a cookbook, for a recipe for, I think it's like General Tso's chicken. And those bowls, like we all know those bowls.
Yeah, and also like the vinegar with like the yellow label and the scallions is just something that I like see all the time. But like, you know, my parents cook, and it was just like so nice to see that sort of like.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like
yeah.
visually, that's like there's like a connection among so many of us, right? It's like, of course, that's the type of vinegar, and of course we use that sriracha, you know.
All right, so I'm going to be asking another question. So first of all, I would like to thank you about just sharing your story. It was so inspiring about your books and the amount of creativity and work that you put in. I had no idea how many hours and how long it would take.
So many.
So I was scrolling around on your website, and you also showed it in this presentation. You showed the portraits of the unsure. And I noticed that they're really unique. Like they're like these kind of whimsical, wholesome, humorous, like little charming drawings that are just so cute. But they really like express feelings that are really deep, and like some like racism or like anxiety, and these little lessons that are not only for children but of all ages. So I was wondering like how you develop this whole like style. And was it something that was from your own childhood when you're writing your own like little books, or was it like, later on in life?
Yeah, good question. Well, thank you. So the portraits of the unsure are, you know, a series of these sort of like cartoon things. And I actually made these remember when I was like, my life kind of fell apart. Well, that was sort of when I started these, and it was, you know, just sort of processing my feelings and my emotions, and like sort of I was like journaling a lot, but it was sort of like, where is this going? Like it's just like me talking to myself. But I felt like to make like a work of art about each feeling sort of like solidified it for me, like for me to look back at it, it's like, yes, that is how I feel. Like it was affirming to myself, to see them. And I don't really have like, I wish I had like a formula to tell you guys of how I made them, but it really was just like thinking about how I'm feeling. And, you know, for this example, it was just like, I was feeling very broken. Like I didn't know, I lost my career. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know where I was going. And thinking about, you know, like, but that doesn't mean that's the end of things. And I sort of like try to relate it to some sort of character, right? It's always, when you have a character that's depicted, it's always so much more powerful, right? And, you know, on top of that, for me, it's like, I just love humor in life in general, whether it's like an awful time in life or it's like a happy time or beautiful. It's like, again, like I say, if you put humor into it, it like it makes life so much richer. And that's something that I wanted to make sure I put in these two. I know I didn't quite answer it, but it's because I don't know how I made them. I just like, it's like when you make art that's just like true to yourself, it just kind of like happens, right? There's no formula. And I think that's what's hard about art too, and making books. It's like, okay, you can't just like create a great idea and like create the perfect story. It takes a lot of time and marinating, and like you don't know when that good idea is going to come. You just have to trust that it'll come at some point.
Right, yeah. So like while you were like kind of navigating this career and like figuring everything out through art, was there anything that like you wanted to convey to like your audience with that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what I've always wanted to convey, and especially now, recently, is this idea that like all of our stories matter. Like every experience that each of us has experienced, or anything that we want to tell is inherently valuable just because it is yours, right? It is your unique story. And I think that's one thing I've really learned a lot from doing these comics about Asian identity is, I have so many people who have responded back being like, telling me their personal story that like, my comic made them think of or made them remember. And I think that's like the most powerful thing about art is like, art is like, okay, it could be like beautiful to look at, but if there's no personal story behind it, if there is no like true authentic thread that binds it together, then it's not going to be very impactful. And so I think that's also why so much of my work is very personal and like sometimes a little vulnerable, but I think it's great that it like connects people in that way too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like that, it's all about that human connection that you can make through art. And
yeah, and I think that's like, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like this idea, it's like, the one of the hardest things about life is like feeling lonely and alone. Anytime at one point we all feel that loneliness, and to be able to connect to each other, especially through art, is like so valuable. So, okay, sorry, that's it.
Yeah, and like no, like speaking of that, like human connection through art, like it also works the other way. Like you being like sort of influenced by like other people. Like, is there somebody from like the AAPI community who's like influenced you, or like has a story that's like really interesting to you?
I was thinking about that, and I don't think there's like one or even a few like specific people, like celebrities or anything. It's like what's really actually kind of inspired me again is like hearing from just like random people on Instagram that message me with their own stories. And I think that's like really the most inspirational to me is like people acknowledging that they matter, right? And their identity matters. And that sort of like fuels me even more. But the comedian Ronnie Cheng, if I had to choose one, we've been sort of like chatting on Instagram, and I think like I really admire him because he is like very thoughtful, and a lot of people see him as a comedian and he's like super funny, but he's also like very thoughtful and articulate, especially about Asian identity and racial justice too. So.
First, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story because, like, even though I'm South Asian, it was really nice to be able to relate to some more broadly Asian experiences that your work expresses. So, I just had a couple of questions. First, are there any interesting things other than the hugging incident that you already mentioned that you've noticed about differences between the two cultures, especially that you've grown up in both?
Mm-hmm. So many. And I think a lot, it's like we've talked, it's kind of circulated around a lot where it's like, well, my parents like never really tell me they love me. I know they love me. And that's the other thing about food, right? That I forgot to mention is like, my parents show their love through food. They will peel my fruit for me, right? They will like take me out to this really nice dinner. My mom will like cook my favorite fish. And so it took me a long time to like really figure that out, where it's like, my parents don't say they love me and therefore they don't love me. Well, that's not true. Like, of course they love me, but it's just shown in a different way. Same thing with like saying that they're proud of me. I mean, actually only recently have they started saying that. And I can tell it's like a big effort for them. And, part of that is that they've lived in Canada, for 30, they're back in Canada now. So, they've been there for many decades, and maybe it's infiltrated their minds too. But I do feel like there's a difference in, like Asian culture in Asia and like Western North American culture. And I like to use the subway as an example where, you know, here, and I'm not saying one is right and the other is wrong or one is better, but it's just a different mentality, right? Where here it's like, okay, if there's a packed subway and some guy is leaning on a pole, for him, he's like, I'm going to lean on the pole. If somebody has a problem with that, they're just going to come up and tell me, like, can you not lean on the pole? I need to use it. And then it's like, not a big deal, right? And then it'd be our responsibility to be like, I need that pole, so I'm going to ask for that and like assert myself, right? Whereas in Asia, no one would ever lean on a pole if it's full, because it's like the mentality of Asian culture is you're thinking about other people, right? You're always sort of like considering other people and what they might need. But it's also like not my responsibility to assert myself either, right? So it's like, it's just different. It's not that one is better or worse. It's just very different.
Yeah, I guess that ties into like my second question. Now that you're living in the US, how do you still keep in touch with your Asian heritage?
Food. And I actually go back to Hong Kong pretty often. When I went there for middle school, I'm still pretty good friends with a lot of my friends there. So I try to go back. I used to go back every year. My parents lived there for a while, like a decade ago. But I'll go back a lot. And also, like most recently, I've been working on this graphic memoir. And that has been surprisingly such like a wonderful opportunity to like reconnect with my culture and my heritage and like my family legacy, right? I've gotten to interview my dad about everything. I've talked to my mom about it. I've talked to my aunts and uncles about what they remember about that time. We had found a tape of that I barely remember this, but when I was in my teens in high school, I had interviewed my grandmother about this story of like running away during the Sino-Japanese War. And so to like listen to that again and like hear her voice, she's no longer with us, is incredible. And then to think of like making this graphic novel that's going to be basically like a family heirloom of sorts has been pretty awesome. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. And yeah, it's a great way to tie in like two of the things you love together. That's really cool. And you mentioned like the car incident with that man when you were a kid. But nowadays, if you still deal with microaggressions or racist incidents, or just like think about incidents like the recent Atlanta shooting and all the anti-Asian hate going on, how have you learned to deal with them and not dwell on them?
I mean, I don't know if I've even learned that. I think we're still trying to like figure it out. And I do feel like there is, I mean, here's the thing, right? Is like any sort of change, any sort of like cultural or systemic change takes a really long time. And if you look at history, it's like, slavery, that seems crazy now, but like back then it took a long time for that to sort of be abolished. And I think the same thing about racial injustice is like, I have to remind myself, one, it takes a lot of time. And I think, I feel a little bit more hopeful about it because there is so much discussion about it. And there is so much out there to read and discuss. And like people are talking about it, right? Not just like anti-Asian or AAPI issues, but also like Black Lives Matter and like all sorts. And I think that's great. Like, it doesn't mean that everyone's getting everything right. Like, obviously not. We still have major issues happening, but there's something that's like picking up momentum, right? And then in dealing with like microaggressions or actually even like harassment, I took the bystander intervention training by Hollaback. I think they're still giving them, and I highly recommend it. And it sort of just gives you some tools of like how to respond in productive ways. And I think that's kind of helped me. I've been very fortunate to not have had any like serious bad interactions over the last few months, mostly because I'm just like at home working. But I do feel like I have this toolkit now to sort of like address these things too.
Okay, great. And I guess just to shift to more about your career and also representation in your career, do you think your profession is diverse? And when you first started, did you feel like it was a career path that was accessible to you?
Good question. I mean, I think if I go back before I started this career, I think there was something that was a little bit of a barrier, and not so much like a societal barrier, but more of like a cultural and personal barrier where, again, it's like my parents are like, you're going to very good schools and we're helping pay for these schools. Like, please do something that will give you a career that like gives you financial stability. And I think that was like a big, a big barrier for me personally, where it's like I had to step outside of that fear. And yeah, it's like I can still fail. I can still fail too. But within the illustration and book community, it's not, it's not the most diverse. It's predominantly white, but there's a fair share of like Asian representation, but not much of like Latinx or Black community. And the cool thing is that publishing, and specifically children's book publishing, are making a lot of effort in bringing in more diversity into that. And it's, for me, I've been very fortunate where it's like I did go to good schools, and I had access to resources to get me into this industry. Like I could, I have like, I could sign up for a conference, which is where I found my agent, right? But in terms of, actual representation in books, that is also something that's like a work in progress too, right? Where I think even most recently, there's a lot of children's books that have more, like Asian characters or Black characters or Latinx characters, which is great. But I think the struggle right now in the industry is like, it's not just about like seeing the faces, right? That is important. Like for a kid to see, like growing up, I didn't see people who look like me in books or movies, right? And I would have loved to have done that. But there's also something a little bit deeper where it's not just about like the way the character looks, but it's like building in the culture behind that character too. That's important to like put in books.
Yeah, building off of that whole idea of like looking at these characters, did you like see any Asian representation in media or film while growing up, or was that more like not common?
Yeah, not really. You know what? Like when I think, I mean, I'm kind of old. I look older. I mean, I look younger than I am, honestly. But the only Asian characters I remember seeing was like that the Chinese kid in Goonies, who was like the goofy guy, right? And then like Mr. Miyagi and Karate Kid. Like those were my two reference points. And I think that like thinking back on it now, I'm like, I think that really was like not detrimental, but to me, it was like I only saw white culture was the main culture, right? White characters, the way that white kids lived lives, was the way to be. And so I wanted to emulate that. Like I remember very specifically being so glad that my middle name is Karen, which is like an English name versus like having a Chinese middle name. And like thinking back, I'm so ashamed of that, because like, well, now I would love to have my Chinese middle name, right? Like there's something I should be proud of. But back then, growing up, it was like, that was something I just wanted to like erase and be like, I'm just like you guys. So I think it's gotten so much better now. I mean, it's better. It's better.
Yeah, and I think like representation, like also to do with like the comic that that's like on the screen now, like that little boy in the comic, seeing like in your book, I think it was like the great indoors.
Mhm.
Like seeing like the rice cooker and seeing, like all of like the wall hangings and the slippers on the floor. Like it's small, but it matters. And like it shows that like, you're not alone and like you're not weird for like having these things.
Right, exactly. So, right. So for those of you who don't know, I illustrated a book called The Great Outdoors, and it's about animals. Like this family goes away camping, and then it's a bunch of animals that come into the house. And it's like about animals, but I wanted to use it as an opportunity to like represent Chinese culture, or like an Asian family living in America, right? And I think a lot of people think about diversity and representation as like faces and characters and people, like, yes, obviously. But to me, I felt like I could also show representation and diversity through the setting. So within this house, it's like very clearly an Asian American house where it's like there's a scroll and there's a rice cooker and there's like all things that I grew up with, right? Like the slippers and so I was doing a school visit, and this is the comic about it, where this kid was like, he was like so shy, he was so cute, and he just like had his little hand up, and he was like, oh, I thought maybe I saw some Chinese words because I also speak Chinese. And the more I like pointed out different things, more of like the Asian kids were just, this is like their Me Too, right? So they were just like, me too. And they were getting like crazier and crazier the more they saw. And that like, I mean, to this day, that's one of the most valuable experiences I've had, like sharing my books.
And like going back to the whole idea of like having that tension with your family, I remember you saying that like you had this period of time where you're deciding to like just choosing art for yourself or as like a career. Like, how did that play out? And like, did that relate? Like, did you have any tension with your Asian identity with that? Or like, how is your thought process?
That's such a good question, because I feel like as an Asian woman, and also, I mean, it's also my personality too, but like as an Asian woman, I grew up with this idea of like always thinking about other people, right? And people have expectations, and always like meeting those expectations. To like growing up, the message that was given to me, not just by my parents, but like by the Asian community, was like success means meeting expectations, right? Obviously, when I like my life blew up, I like did not meet the expectations of my parents. I mean, granted, I was an adult, but still, like there was something that was like heartbreaking to me about disappointing my parents. And so, but in the end, it's been sort of like this amazing thing that's happened, where a lot of times we think like, okay, our parents are like set in their ways, like this is who they are, and they're older, and like this is how they lived. And the wonderful thing that happened through my transition in career and life is, my parents were able to realize like, okay, maybe like financial stability is still important, and like it's, yes, you're not turning out how we expected you to be, but that's not necessarily a bad or negative thing, right? And for them, they've been able to articulate since then. They're like, you know what? Actually, it's not even about money. We want you to do two things with whatever you do, right? The first thing is that you're doing something that helps people. And that could be in any sort of way, right? So like when I was doing nonprofit work, it was like working with families in underserved communities. And making books, it's like, it's a different way of helping, right? Kind of like this comic here. It's like, it's impacting kids in a different way. So they were like, as long as you help people, and two, as long as you have integrity in everything you do. So as long as you are honest and you are like noble in what you do, then that is success. And I keep thinking about that now, like as a full-blown adult, I still think about that. And my parents are still here, obviously, but I think about that a lot, where it's like, yeah, like success, a lot of times in the world, we sort of calibrate it based on like money or like followers or, like fame, all this other stuff. But when you think about it in terms of these sort of like softer, like more life valuable things, like having integrity and helping people, it's like, yeah, I am doing that. I am successful. So I really like that question. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah, I really like that. I think many kids should, at like around this age or like younger, should really hear that with like how we define success.
Mhm.
So, I have another question for you. Like what direction do you think like the perception of API is shifting, or like, or how like in the future, you would like your work to show more of or connect with your audience?
I think it's still like really, for me, boils down to that idea of storytelling and connection. And I think it's like that's sort of how any change happens, is like on that grassroots level of people being like personally invested and personally connecting to other people. And once all those people are connecting, that's sort of where there's like power, right, to change. And again, it's like I haven't really quite figured out like what I'm making these comics because that's sort of like what is on my heart right now. But I don't really even have necessarily like this grand strategy of like where are these going to go, or what do they do, and what is like my role in all of this change. Like that's too much pressure. But I think again, it's like having that integrity and like that intention of like what can I contribute in what I do, right? I make comics. I'm not like a public speaker. I'm not like I'm not a politician. I never will be, but that's okay. And I think realizing that each of us has sort of like our own different role in change is important. And the idea of like, oh, my role in change can also be aligned to something that I really love doing and I'm like good at, is kind of amazing, right? And again, I feel like there is change with that, where there are a lot of people who are sort of speaking out, right? They're sharing their stories. They're saying like, I matter, my identity matters. These are experiences that I've had. And, hearing like actors and celebrities say that, that's great. And yeah, that's like super powerful, but also hearing like those everyday people, it feels like everything's kind of shifting on every level too.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Like the power to change. I think that's really what our like Edgemont this committee and the Scarsdale's Ace Club is all about, and how we got together.
That's awesome. I mean, I wish I had that in my high school when I was in high school, but we didn't. I mean, I think that's also like something important too, right? Is like sort of like smashing some of the stereotypes of Asian and like the model minority, right? Where it's like, especially for Asian women, there's this idea of like Asian women are like, they're like quiet and they're like sweet. And it's like, no, I mean, some of us are, yeah, that's fine. And some of us aren't, right? Some of us are loud, some of us are funny, some of us can be angry, some of us can be quiet, like just sort of like rounding out this perception of like Asians, they're like people, they're like three-dimensional people and not just like this like group of stereotypes.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's like a great point. Miss Joseph, do you know if we have any audience questions? If not, I think we're getting close to 8, so it would be cool if we could wrap it up if we don't have any audience questions.
I don't see anything yet, but we'll give the community a little bit of time.
Yeah, I know there's like a little bit of a delay.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, I guess I have one more question while we wait for the audience questions to file in. And you've kind of explained this already, but I just want to know how have your experiences and your heritage like benefited you, your career, and how has it developed your art over time?
Hmm, that's a good question. I mean, I think sort of like developing like my art, it's sort of like any artist is like what you see growing up, you sort of start to like develop like ideas of what is just like personally appealing to you. So for me, that picture of when I was 2, I was reading a Richard Scarry book. I don't know if you guys know Richard Scarry books, but it's like the Busy Town books where there's just like a lot going on and they're like really quirky little characters. And even now that's like, oh, that's the kind of book I want to make. And maybe that's because it was like something that I grew up reading, or maybe it's just like me personally, that's like something that I gravitate towards. But I do feel like for me, most recently, and especially making this graphic novel, it's like I never thought that I would, to me, it was like, I love drawing animals. I'm going to make books about animals. I'm going to make comics about animals. Like, this is like what I love to do. But, all of this stuff that's been happening, as negative as it is, has really made me really sort of reassess, like, okay, yeah, like what is my identity as an Asian and as a Chinese woman? And so that's kind of why I'm making this graphic novel, is like sort of exploring something that's actually really important and something that I didn't even realize was so important until recently. So, I mean, I think that's the thing that's sort of like rough about all this stuff between like Black Lives Matter movement and this, is like it's coming out of really difficult things that are happening and awful things, but it is generating a lot of good as well. And I think that's something that I keep having to remind myself, and I hope we can all remind ourselves of too.
Yeah, because it's so easy to just get bogged down by all the negativity and, all of like the hate. But yeah, I think it's important to remind ourselves it's not all dark and it's not all, pain. And yeah, just like there's joy in like our cultural identity. It's not just something that like brings us negativity. So yeah,
Exactly.
so now with that, that sort of brings us to like the end of the talk. And it was like such an honor to like listen to you talk, Ruth. And it was so like really just inspiring and like motivating to learn about like, your career journey and like your life experiences. And so yeah, we're just really glad that you took the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks so
And
much for having me.
yeah, and like thank you to everyone else, like Miss Earl who got us in touch. Like Mr. Hosier, Miss Joseph, everyone like here, like Serena, Karen, Nista, you guys, yeah, and like all the EHS faculty that's just been supporting us. And so yeah, just like we're really thankful to everyone that could just make this happen.
Absolutely. It was an honor to talk to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Great